The Haunting Tales of Dark Shivering. Dark Shivering is a village that sits between two countries. The Welsh don't claim it and the English don't want it. Instead, the dead roam freely between this world and the next. Pay no mind to the curtain blowing in the corner. That's just the wind. But the old hag at the end of your bed, she's a demon. Enjoy. A Haunting on Boxbush Road. In 1973, Susan was 10 years old and living in a terraced house on Boxbush Road. She was an only child and she lived there with her mum and dad. The houses along both sides of the street were all the same except for the one Susan's family and their neighbor lived in. Joining their two houses together was an archway, and the archway led to both back gardens, a luxury none of the other houses had. The family had lived there since Susan was born in 1963, but by 1973, Susan's mother Doreen had begun to suffer with some debilitating mental health problems, and had become anorexic. Doreen was a stay-at-home mother, as was the norm in those days, whilst her husband worked for the family cleaning business. He worked long hours and would be out of the house every morning by 5 a.m. This seemed to be where the problems started. Previous to working for the family business, Susan's father, Ron, worked in a local factory. His hours were much shorter then, with a start time of 8 a.m. When Susan told me about her childhood experiences, she told me that her mother's mental health problems had been caused by paranormal activity in their house. It had begun innocently enough when Don started leaving the house earlier in the mornings. Susan would lay in their bed having been awoken by her husband leaving. She started to hear the attic door opening by itself every morning. The old terraced house was an odd design. It had 2 bedrooms upstairs, but you had to walk through the first bedroom to get to the second. The first bedroom that you walked through was Susan's room, and in that room was a door that led up to the attic. The door was only 5 foot high and it was always kept closed to keep the heat in the bedroom. The attic was old and dirty. The family only used it for storing their Christmas decorations and some old furniture. Just as many children wouldn't like an attic door in their bedroom, Susan was no different. She sometimes thought it opened in the night when she was trying to get to sleep. She would hide under the duvet until sleep took over. Doreen found the attic door opening more of an annoyance at first. She thought maybe it pulled open when her husband slammed the downstairs door shut and the draft was pushing it open. It would start creaking back and forth as the draft blew through and kept her awake unless she went to close it. Progressively, the door creaking annoyed Doreen so much she had her husband fit a new lock onto it so it would not keep blowing back open. This worked for about a week and then Doreen's nightmare really started. One morning after her husband had just left for work, she couldn't believe her ears when she heard the familiar creak of the attic door. She lay there irritated that the door had somehow come open again. This time, however, the creaking was followed by loud footsteps. Doreen lay in her bed listening intently to the noises, thinking maybe Susan had gotten out of bed to come and see her. She waited for her to come into the room. But it wasn't Susan who came into her bedroom, it was a man. The man was old and shuffling towards her bed. Doreen was terrified and frozen in fear. As she stared in horror, the old man jumped on the bed and began to throttle her. Try as she might, Doreen could not move. The man's hands were tight around her neck, but as Doreen stared up at him, she could see he was translucent, and she could see the whole room through him. Doreen passed out. When she next awoke, she didn't know if it had been the worst nightmare of her life or real. Her question was answered 3 days later when the same thing happened to her again. Her nerves were shot to pieces, and her husband didn't know what to do. When he was there, nothing like this ever occurred. After weeks of this recurring attack, Doreen decided to speak to Susan about it. She couldn't believe this was really happening to her without her daughter hearing or seeing anything. And she was right. Susan hadn't wanted to say anything to her mum as her mum was suffering enough with her own issues, but Susan had been having paranormal activity in her bedroom too. She told her mum that some mornings she would hear the attic door open and an old man would come into her room. He would walk around her bed and head into her mother's room. That's all she ever saw of the man, but after he had gone into the other bedroom, Susan would see lots of little devil-type creatures at the bottom of her bed. They were demonic-looking and seemed to be making sure Susan didn't move as they crawled, climbed and rolled all over the end of the bed. Susan would pull the covers over her head and hide until it was time to get up for school. Doreen was horrified. If Susan had been seeing the same man in the mornings, then it couldn't be in her mind. It must have been an evil entity. Doreen spent some time in a psychiatric hospital after these events began. She needed help with her eating disorder and nervous disposition. Whilst she was away, there was never any activity in the house. One day, as Doreen was recuperating at home, she was hanging the washing on the line in the garden and her neighbor chatted away to her whilst tending to her vegetable patch. As the women conversed, Doreen offered her neighbor to come in for a cuppa, and so the two women headed for the house. As they sat in the kitchen talking about their children and families, her neighbor mentioned that she used to be in Doreen's house all the time when the previous family lived there. They were the Buffon family and she was good friends with them at the time. She went on to say, Mrs. Buffon used to hold seances in the kitchen whilst her husband was at work. Being a Christian herself, Doreen was quite horrified at the thought of seances being held in her house. But the neighbor went on to say that Mrs. Buffon would contact the dead around the kitchen table with friends and neighbors for years. She also took to using a Ouija board too. Doreen couldn't believe her ears, and she asked her neighbor what happened to the Buffons before she moved there. The neighbor told her that Mr. Buffon had strangled his wife in the bedroom and gone on to hang himself in the attic. No one knew the reason why. It was just a tragic event which left their son, John Buffon, mother and fatherless in his 30s. Doreen asked the neighbor if she had a photo of him, but the only thing the neighbor had was the newspaper article of the murder-suicide. There was a black and white photo of the family, and Doreen could plainly see that Mr. Buffon was the old man that was attacking her in her bedroom. Doreen was sent back into Coney Hills Psychiatric Hospital shortly after this. Whilst she was recovering in the asylum, her husband moved the family to another property a couple of miles from the old house. Doreen never had to endure any more paranormal attacks after moving house. She and her husband are still alive today, and still live in the house they moved to from Boxbush Road. Doreen still follows her Christian faith to ward off any evil parasites or entities. And her mental health and eating disorder are all under control. If you are a paranut like me, please consider subscribing to my channel. There are plenty more ghostly tales to share, and you don't want to miss them. From imps to demons, vampires to ghosts and dogmen to poltergeists. Dark Shivering has them all.